Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Bear at Midnight by Lexie Conyngham, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Sigrid! Sigrid! For a moment, Sigrid paid no attention. Her bare feet were numb in the cold water, and her fingers were almost useless as she pulled and poked at the stems she was trying to haul out of the stream. Sigrid! Noop, her farmhand, slid down the last few paces of the crumbly amber cliff and landed with his own feet in the stream. Do those not sting? Sigrid grabbed the last of the nettles and dragged them onto the sack she had brought, as flat as she could make it on the bank. No, not when they've been soaking for a while. Anyway, I can't feel anything. She stumbled out of the water, bracing herself against the sharp pain as feeling returned to her toes. She twisted the sacking around the heap of soggy stems and with a flick of the arm had them up and on her shoulder. At once the cold water trickled down into her clothing. Her sleeve was soaked. Can I get the other ones? Asked Noop. She shook her head. They're not ready yet. Did you come down here to help with that? She asked, mildly surprised. Noop preferred working with the animals, though he was a willing enough boy with all the farm work, and he was busy now with their small harvest. Oh, no. Noop took the bundle from her. He was growing strong. No, I came to tell you the news. Einar's dead. Well, it had been coming. Sigrid, her cold feet decently booted and in a clean shift, overdress and headcloth, sat with the other women of Buckquoy in the great hall that had been Einar's domain. They had prepared the body and now guarded it just as they ought. Einar Einarsson made a long, thin corpse, Sigrid thought, so little of him left sideways you could nearly lay him in one of the new drains up on the headland at Biersay. It was an irreverent thought, and she silently apologized to Einar's shade and to that of her late husband, Thorstein, who had been Einar's man. Thorstein had died of water on the chest several years ago. Einar had died of... well, he had just faded away. Really. He had been quite a warrior once, long ago. Well, not that long ago. Then he'd come home and learned to read, Latin, not runes, and surrounded himself with his books and his bored herd. Well, some of the men were bored, missing the summer raiding, and others, and she could name names, were simply too lazy to bother. And then his wife had betrayed him. Reinveig, handsome and clever, and Einar's constant companion and counselor, and she had betrayed him. It had left Einar shattered. You could as well say he had died then a couple of years ago. If he had lived at all, it was to keep Reinveig where he could see her, under his thumb, with none of her old freedoms to do and to speak. Her betrayal had broken both of them, though the other man was now dead. Who will take over, though? Her friend Helga, beside her, broke quietly into her thoughts. Sigrid shifted her cold feet. Outside the hall, the endless autumn winds lashed rain against the high wooden door. She wished she could have brought her nettles to work on. Her fingers itched when they were idle. Whoever Thorfinn appoints, I suppose. If her husband Thorstein had been Einar's man, Einar had been Thorfinn's. Well, yes, but who? Sigrid glanced around. Helga's eyes were bright. Could she possibly think her own husband, Rolf, would be in the running? Next to her was Frogan, daughter of another of Einar's less impressive followers. Oh, my father's already in deep discussions over it. She was a hardy, bright girl and struggled to keep her voice respectfully low. No doubt it will all be sorted out soon. It would be an important gift, this hall of Buckquoy. It guarded the land bridge to Thorfinn's settlement on the headland of Biersay, and overlooked the precious harbor down below. Thorfinn Sigurdarson, Earl of Orkney, and more besides, might have stepped back from raiding, but he knew how to defend his extensive lands. He would not give the place to someone he did not trust and did not think capable. Rolf might be trustworthy, but was he capable? Sigrid was not at all sure. Helga, though, would manage the domestic side of a hall very well. It's a shame Einar had no sons, said Sigrid, dodging the question of Rolf. No sons with Reinveg, no, said Helga with a little lift of her eyebrows. He wasn't married before, said Sigrid, knowing that was hardly relevant. If Einar had fathered a boy and acknowledged him, the boy could as easily inherit. She was, though. Hasn't she a daughter? Thordis, yes, said Helga, who knew everything. This, Sigrid supposed, came from her habit of hanging about the harbor, waiting for traders to offer her their goods and sometimes other favors they might have available. Thordis has been staying with Reinveg's family in Kirkevarg, but I think they've sent for her. Is she married? Not yet, no, Helga said without emphasis. Sigrid wondered why not. Reinveg and Einar had been married quite a while, so this Thordis from a previous marriage must be of a wedding age. Anyway, she's not going to get the hall. I'd say the men are already wondering which of them it will be. Odor and Ulf are too old. Sigrid began the inevitable list quietly, as the women near them were all wives or daughters of these men, too. Frogan was Odor's daughter. Wouldn't you say, Frogan? Oh, far too old, Frogan laughed again. Ulf, yes, Helga agreed. Odor might think he has a chance. Rolf, of course. She named her own husband quickly, as if warding off any objection Sigrid might make. Afi, maybe. Or Thorfinn might bring in someone from outside Buckquoy, said Sigrid, already disheartened at the possibilities within Einar's herd. Didn't Einar have a brother? Helga ventured, not entirely sure. What was his name? And I think he had boys. If he had, I've never seen them, said Sigrid. Would Thorfinn even know them? Well, then someone in his own circle. Ketil? Helga's voice took on a low, suggestive tone that annoyed Sigrid much more than it should. I don't think Ketil is ready the man for the job, she muttered. He's barely here. But when he is, I think Ketil would make a very fine leader, said Helga, not quite caught up with the idea. Look at Reinveg, said Sigrid, desperate to change the subject. Did you ever see a woman so collapsed in on herself? Reinveg, Einar's widow, had been an extremely handsome woman, capable and intelligent. Sigrid had half admired, half envied her for years as she ran her husband's hall and longhouse, brewed and baked, oversaw dairy and salting, and even, it was said, was her husband's chief adviser on matters both political and military. She also had excellent taste in her clothing, which Sigrid particularly appreciated, as she herself had made much of that clothing in exchange for the fine produce of Reinveg's domestic business. But Reinveg had not ordered so much as a length of braid nor a nail-binding hat for a few years now, and what clothes she wore, appropriate enough for a widow only that she had been wearing them for some time, were shabby and old and showed signs of the daily manual work she still did or oversaw meticulously. But you could feel when a longhouse was not loved, when a hall lacked a heart, and that was the case at Einar's. The question that tickled the back of Sigrid's mind, though, was what Reinveg might do now. She looked broken and faded, but would Einar's death give her the freedom to come back to life? A young woman appeared from the doorway at the back of the hall, and for a moment Sigrid took her to be one of the servants. Then she realized she had never seen the woman before, and as for being a servant, it seemed unlikely when the woman went and touched Reinveg on the shoulder. Reinveg straightened a little and looked up at her. They spoke quietly together. "Who's that?" Sigrid asked, just as quietly. Helga glanced over, eyebrows raised. "Oh, Thordis has arrived then. Well, anyway, who else could it be?" Reinveg's daughter, brought back from Kirkevarg. Sigrid gave her a more detailed assessment. "She's very handsome, after her mother, presumably." "Oh, yes, she's her mother's daughter in that respect." "Who was her father?" "No one I ever met. Fine someone, I think." Frogan laughed. "I thought you two knew everything. I'm disappointed." "I'm surprised she's not married." "I know," Helga agreed. "She's clever, too, like Reinveg, and she has all the right skills. She's supposed to be a wonderful tablet weaver and wool worker." "Is she?" said Sigrid, instantly defensive. There were too few customers to go round, and she badly needed all of them. But then no doubt Thordis would go back to Kirkevarg after the funeral, and they would hear no more about her. Maybe she'll take Reinvig away to Kirkevarg, too, after the funeral, she said, finishing her thought out loud. It might do Reinvig good to get away from Buckquoy. Helga, though, had dismissed the diminished Reinvig, always much more interested in what the men were up to. I think I'd watch the nephews, she murmured. They'll think they'll get the hall anyway. Thorfinn might well give it to one of them. Where are the nephews, though? Where is Einar's brother? Oh, I think the brother's dead. And as for the nephews, now, what did I hear? She began to tap a foot on the stone floor as if it might jog her memory into action. Sigrid laid a hand on her knee to stop her before she drew attention to herself in the quiet hall. Thorfinn's men, of course, though the brother was much less close to Thorfinn than Einar was. Are they in the islands? I'm sure Reinvig has summoned them. Reinvig of old would have had it all worked out. Who was to inherit, what position she would hold unofficially, what influence she would have. Sigrid sighed. Seemed like a lot of work when one could be weaving. Young men, though, presumably? Oh, I should think so. Our age. A match for you, Frogan. Frogan blushed and grinned. You never know. Helga, contentedly married, smiled and moved on. You might get yourself a new husband too, Sigrid. Said Sigrid, unimpressed. She had had one of those. She was not racing to find herself another. It was all very well for Helga. Rolf was so useless, Helga ran everything as if Rolf were away on a perpetual raid. And that was a thought. What will the men do if the new leader wants to go on raids again? They're not used to it at all now. She tried to sound sympathetic, though in fact the Buckquoy men were a useless lot in her opinion. I think they're over on the east mainland. Deerness, somewhere about there. Not far, anyway. Then Thorfinn will know all about them. Thorfinn knew most things. I still think he might appoint from among his own herd, someone who deserves a bit of a reward, and you have to admit Thorfinn's being very generous to Ketil recently. I think he's in with a chance. Ketil in charge of Buckquoy. Sigrid had known Ketil since they were children in Huthabar on and off, and therefore had a healthy lack of respect for his abilities. If he were in command here, he would need an eye kept on him. That was clear. And who would run his household? It would be chaos. Where is Ketil anyway? Helga asked, in that creamy tone she always slipped into when she talked about Ketil. Sigrid was fairly sure that Ketil had never actually fallen into Helga's clutches, but there was always that niggling doubt. Westray, I believed, she said, pleased for once to know something Helga did not. I suppose someone will have sent word there too, said Helga after a moment. Westray's not so far away. Well, no, you can see it on a good day, said Sigrid, and then wished she had not. Ketil Gunnarsson, standing outside a hall on a broad green hill on Westray, was not looking towards Bursay, but then he was not having a good day. It did not help that Thorfinn, his lord, had clearly thought this was some kind of privileged promotion for Ketil. Not that he was bestowing this gift in the magnanimous hope of some return. Thorfinn was feeling guilty, and since he had become a Christian, Thorfinn felt guilty about quite a number of things that had probably never bothered his head under the old beliefs. Watching Thorfinn trying to make amends was sometimes touching and sometimes appalling. In this case, it was simply cringingly awkward. So, he said, ignoring the soft rain that was trickling down the collar of his new shirt, a gift from Thorfinn's wife, her own way of assuaging guilt. So, tell me again what exactly happened? Leaning against the wall, just at the edge of his vision, he could see his three men, ostensibly there to support him, but, as he could clearly sense, trying not to laugh. Well, Scory and Alf were trying. He was not sure he had ever seen Jared laugh. Jared's yellow dog, which followed him everywhere, was seated, yawning, by his side. On the other side of Scory, tethered by a strong rope, was a small black pig. One of the Westray men felt before him struggled with the words. He was small by Westray standards. Most of the Westray men Ketil had met had been large, powerful, quick with their fists, and with a keen sense of justice. This one was slightly shorter than Ketil, who was himself well above the middle height. As for his sense of justice, well, that was what had brought Ketil here, or why Thorfinn had sent him. Westray was a large island to the north of the Orkneyinga mainland, north of Rousay, too. The land was rich and fertile, even if, in Ketil's opinion, it was dangerously flat for an island. There were several large longhouses with prosperous farms about them. The one here at Langscale was perhaps the best he had seen, and commanded a fine view down to the sea, over the Skerries to Rousay, with a glimpse of the west mainland, and the brow of Bursay beyond. Even on a foggy day, which seemed to Ketil to be about 6 days of 7 here, you could sense Thorfinn's eye on you from his settlement on the Brow. In fact, he wondered that there was a dispute to be settled here at all. But even with the rain, he had a niggling feeling that the stuttering man had tears in his eyes. The small black pig watched the men with interest. After all, she had started all this. Ketil waited. Was that what Thorfinn would do? No. What Thorfinn would do would be to delegate the various matters that required his adjudication on this island to Ketil, calling it promotion while he stayed at home and did more important things. No, that was unfair. Thorfinn did settle disputes within his lands and rarely delegated. He really did think that this was an honor for Ketil. Ketil, too, had probably thought it was something like that, while the other cases were being sorted out, an insult apologized for there, a fine paid for an injury in another place. It had all been going very smoothly, well, until he had met the pig. The bigger of the 2 men before him, who was propped against the longhouse wall with his arms folded, each one of them the width of one of Scory's legs, which were not themselves small, gave a grunt of disgust. "He took my pig," he said. He pointed to the small black pig, as if the identity of the pig was in any doubt. Ketil nodded. He was glad that they had the right pig anyway. He turned to the smaller man. "Did you steal his pig?" "No." "He did." "I did not." "Right," said Ketil. "Stop. If you didn't steal his pig, Thorth, why does he think you did?" Thorth drew a deep breath, steadying himself visibly. "I didn't steal his pig, I rescued his pig." Ketil blinked. "You rescued his pig?" Thorth nodded. "From what?" "From him!" Thorth pointed at the big man Ozer, who pushed himself away from the longhouse wall. "But it's my pig!" he bellowed. "But you were going to kill her!" Even the pig jumped. The yellow dog heaved up a heartfelt howl till Jared laid a hand on his head. "But it's my pig. That's what you do with pigs." "Not with her." Bravely, Ketil broke in. "A man has the right to kill his own beasts," he said firmly. "Well, yes," agreed the small man. On the whole, Ketil liked him better of the 2, even if he seemed to be making no sense. "See?" said Ozer. From his tone, you would have thought he was some lad at his mother's knee, squabbling with his sister, but now he pulled out his knife. "Give her here," he said to Scory, "and I'll kill her now." The pig, with a keen sense of self-preservation, hid behind Scory's broad legs. Alf and Jared tensed very slightly. Scory frowned, though, and raised a hand. Ketil nodded permission. "Why would you want to kill a young sow?" Scory asked. Unlike Ketil, he had been brought up on a farm. There had been pigs in Hythabeer, disposers of waste and providers of dubious meat, but Ketil had had little to do with them. Has she even had a litter yet? Thorth shook his head and eyes on the pig. "I have another one," said the big man with a mighty shrug. "I can't afford to keep the 2. "You could have sold her. She's a fine pig," said Scory. You have got a good deal for her." "I offered for her," snapped Thorth, "but he wouldn't sell her. He wouldn't sell her to me, see? So I rescued her. Look at her. A fine pig, you say. A lovely pig. Think of the piglets she'd have. How could you kill a pig like that? What a waste." Praise heaven, Ketil thought. He'd begun to think that the man was in love with the pig. "I'd rather kill her than sell her to you," said Ozer, and spat with admirable accuracy just short of Thorth's feet. "So you would sell her to someone else?" Ketil asked. "Nobody else wanted her. Big litters this year. Everybody's got pigs." "Except me," Thorth put in. "I'd buy her." "I'm not selling to you," Ozer repeated. Ketil sighed. "Why won't you sell the pig to Thorth?" he asked. "Because he wouldn't let me marry his sister." "That was 10 years ago," Thorth retorted. "Who's this?" asked Alf, who'd been keeping his eyes open. He nodded his thin head towards a busy-looking man hurrying along the path from the harbor. You have a visitor, Ketil said loudly to Ozer, hoping to break up the argument, but Ozer and Thorf paid him no attention. You've been married to Thora for 7 years, Thorf was objecting. How many years will it take before you'll talk civilly to me again? Never, cried Ozer. You know your sister wanted to marry me. She has no interest in you, never had. The stranger, arriving damply at the longhouse door, looked anxiously from Ozer to Thorf and back. I'm here to find, Ketil Gunnarsson. That's me, said Ketil, wondering what further complication was going to arise. A message from Thorfinn Sigurdarsson. Well, you'd know if I had just said Thorfinn, wouldn't you? Said the man reasonably. He was a local. He must have picked up the message at the harbor and offered to bring it up here. He had an air of unaccustomed importance. It's bad news, I'm afraid. Ketil tensed, eyes on the man, but said nothing. Bad news for him personally, or more generally bad? Ketil tensed. Go on then, man, said Scory, moving closer with the pig on his robe. I was told to tell you that Einar Einarsson is dead, and Thorfinn wants you back on the mainland. As soon as you can manage, he said.